What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And today we are going to be tearing apart the front of the TRX to install some new springs, or at least in my case, one spring. And no, I'm not doing some cool leveling springs or lift springs or whatever. All I'm doing is finally installing my factory service bulletin lean repair springs. And if you guys haven't heard about that, it's a free repair through the dealership, through RAM, obviously, to fix the lean that all of the TRXs have. I'll throw a link up here with the video kind of explaining all of that a lot more in detail. But I thought I would at least kind of really try and nicely document the teardown and installation of a TRX front suspension. So if you are installing aftermarket springs or preload spacers or whatever, you will basically use this exact same procedure on your truck at home. Or if you're having a shop do it, you can at least see what's involved with doing it. There is a few kind of special tools involved. So even if you're just going to remove the shock and spring assembly, take it to a shop so they can disassemble and reassemble it, you can kind of maybe save yourself a little bit of labor time if you're doing the work at home in your driveway. So we're going to get this thing in the shop, get it up on the lift, I'll get a tire off, and then we will start taking this thing apart. I'll try to call out all of the bolt nut sizes, you know, that I'm removing, so you'll be able to have all the tools ready in hand when you take yours apart. And even if you don't have a TRX, it'll be kind of interesting seeing the big hardware that is on the front of these things. So let's get it in the shop and we'll tear it apart. Now that we got this thing lifted up, we've got the wheel off. We can see our shock sitting here. And on a TRX, you've got the remote reservoir that runs all the way up in front of the skid plate here. So I'm gonna need to pull the skid plate off first so I can get that reservoir and the wiring harness unhooked. Now that we've got that skid plate out of the way, we can see our wiring connector and our reservoir. So unfortunately, the wiring connector, you're going to need to get the clip that it's held up to the frame with. I've just got a trim panel tool here that I'll get under that plastic clip and very nicely try to get it pop loose. And then we've got a little plastic lock tab that we'll need to pry up. And then we will push on that white plastic lock tab, and that will unhook that wiring connector. Now next is getting the reservoir out of the way. And all that is just a 13mm bolt up here at the very top. Taking that bolt all the way out, and then you'll be able to just unclip the reservoir and just let it dangle. So guys, now the next thing I like to do is get the sway bar disconnected. Now you'd think to just take the nut off here at either end of the sway bar end link, but typically these will be kind of a bear. The ball or the stud will spin, and I really hate spinning these sway bar end link ends and having them wear the joint. So the easier thing to do is just to unbolt the sway bar. There's two bolts here on the sway bar clamps on either side, one on the driver, one on the passenger. Just go ahead and unbolt, let the sway bar fall down onto the skid plate, and then you'll be able to get the control arms to move since you aren't fighting the sway bar. And those are just a 15mm bolt. Take them all the way out and then go ahead and take the passenger side out. So now that we've got that reservoir and the wiring disconnected and dangling, we've got our sway bar loose so we can get the axle to travel down. We're going to go ahead and break our outer tie rod end loose and our upper control arm loose so we can get the knuckle to kind of fall away from the suspension. Now both of those nuts are going to be a 21mm. Luckily, this thing is new enough that once I got the nut loose, I could just lift that up. If it's stuck for you, you could just give it a few taps with a decent hammer down here, kind of right where that tie rod end attaches. Now for the upper control arm, I throw a pry bar in between the spring and the control arm so it doesn't just jump up once you get that loose. Now the upper ball joint is stuck into the knuckle here. I'll thread the nut on a few turns and then just give it a few hits here on the back side of that steering knuckle to hopefully get that knocked loose. And there is kind of a molded in flat area here on the back side of that steering knuckle that you can give some good hits and finally get that upper control arm ball joint to break loose. We'll get our pry bar so we can pull that back down, get our nut off, and let that control arm come up. And now we've got our steering knuckle swung out of the way. Do be relatively mindful when you are working with that upper control arm. There is a ride height sensor on there, so you don't want to just be prying outrageously past where it should be, since you do have that electronic sensor there. Now the next thing we're going to need to do is take that lower shock bolt loose, and it is a absolutely massive nut and bolt. They're a 30mm head and a 30mm nut. Now I've only got one 30mm socket, so I'm just going to use a crescent wrench on a TRX. Yes, I know, but all we're doing is holding the head of the bolt while we break the nut loose. And yeah, guys, I wasn't kidding. This is the bolt that is about half my arm's length for the lower shock mount. And then the nut, obviously, equally ridiculous. Now this lower shock mount is kind of interesting because we've got this sliding sleeve that slides as you tighten the bolt in to meet the lower shock bushing. But there is a really nice groove here on the bottom that we're going to pry out on to slide the sleeve back out so we can have play and get the lower shock mount out. So all I've got here is a pry bar going at that lower sleeve and just sliding that thing out of the way. And as you guys could obviously see, once we got that sleeve slid outward, that lower shock came out of its mount. And the only thing left is now the 3 upper shock mount bolts, but I'm just using a 16mm wrench, or ratchet wrench in this case, to get those out. Now the back 2 have a wiring harness on them that you'll need to get pried off and out of the way. There you can see that wiring harness, and then one of the nuts, and then the other one is kind of tucked behind that harness. But you've got 3 of those holding that top mount on, and then we've got the wiring harness back there that we are going to need to push up off of the stud. And once we've got the last top bolt out, obviously you'll just lift it and kind of come out of this area that we've made. Now be very mindful laying these things down. You've got connectors, wiring harnesses, your reservoir, all this stuff you don't want to smash, kink, damage, anything like that. Now that we've got the shock and spring assembly off the vehicle. Now you're going to need to disassemble this thing, whether you are installing a new spring or preload spacers or whatever you're doing. Now I am lucky enough to have a strut machine here on the wall that is going to do the job very nicely. They also make spring compressors that you could bolt or clamp down that would take the tension off of the shock, just as this would. Now, one thing you need to be careful about when you are taking that top nut off is really try not to spin the shock shaft when you are taking the nut off. Some of these shocks, if you spin that shock shaft too many times, you can take the shock shaft and unthread it off of the spool valve in the shock. The shock comes apart, it's a whole massive mess. You've ruined a shock at that point. I've got this pretty cool shock disassembly tool that you can put over the nut, and then it also has another piece that you can slide inside, hold the shock shaft with one, and spin the nut loose with the other. So now that we've got that top nut out, we can drop the shock assembly out of the bottom. And again, this is where you'd be installing your preload spacers, or in my case, replacing the whole spring assembly, depending on what job you're doing. Now that we've got our top mount swapped into our new spring, we're ready to set everything back into place. We'll get our shock placed up through the mount. Get our nut started. Now that we've got the top nut tight, before we take all of the tension off of the spring, you're going to want to go and make sure that spring is perfectly sitting in the spring seat for the pigtail on that spring, and make sure just everything's sitting where it needs to sit before you loosen that tension. Now obviously reassembly is going to be just the opposite of what we just did. I'm gonna try to get this thing held up into place with the top mount nuts. Now that we've got those top mount nuts at least loosely installed, we can go ahead and get the lower bolt through. Now I am going to wait to tighten that lower shock bolt down until it is all the way on the ground with the weight of the vehicle. I'll crawl back under it and tighten it, because you do not really want to have that lower bushing tightened at full dropout, and then once you put the vehicle on the ground, that bushing will be in a bind. So get the bolt through, get the nut at least started by hand, and then once you get the vehicle set back down on the ground, then you can tighten up that. Everything else will be able to tighten up because nothing else really has a bushing that's going to be under load or in rotation like the lower shock mount. So we'll get our 16 up here on the top mount nuts and get those tightened. Now don't forget to put the wiring harness clips back in those top mount studs. And next we're going to be ready to get our steering knuckle back into place. And again, I'm just using a pry bar here to walk the control arm down the springs, get my nut started. It is a 21 millimeter again on that upper ball joint nut. And again, these are one of the things you don't just want to sit there and spin with an impact if at all possible. What really works well is if you can use a pry bar, get under the spring and pull a lot of tension down. It almost will seat that ball joint into the steering knuckle, and then you should almost just be able to tighten it right down with no spin. And again, same story with our outer tie rod end. We'll put some pressure down, tighten this thing. Now, obviously, if you were doing both sides of the vehicle, you would obviously be taking apart the other side before you put your sway bar and everything back on. But since I am just doing this one driver's side for the lean repair, I am going to be ready to throw my sway bar back on. But again, if you were taking the other side apart, you would not be putting your front sway bar back on at this time. But since I am ready, I've got those 15 millimeter bolts. We are going to hold that sway bar up into place and start all 4 of the bolts before we tighten them down. Now we'll jump back up front and get our remote reservoir clipped back in. And again, guys, that was that 13 millimeter bolt. And then we've got that shock connector plug in. We'll get the lock tab and then it will go back into its wiring clip. Now we'll be able to get our skid plate thrown back on. It's just those 16 millimeter bolts. A couple here at the back. We've got a couple more and then up obviously at the very front. Now, one thing you will need to do after you change the ride height of any TRX is program the ride height sensors. Now, I don't know of any aftermarket scan tools that do this procedure. If you guys know of any, let me know down in the comment section, but this will probably be something you've got to take into your dealer to have programmed. Now, if you guys know or not, we kind of showed on the other side, every corner of a TRX has a ride height sensor that lets the truck know how high or low it is for, you know, if the truck's jumping, if it's landing, if it's towing and squatted, whatever. When you change the ride height, the truck doesn't know that you leveled, lifted, whatever you did, and the ride height sensors are going to be thinking the truck is, you know, slightly lifted up or whatever. The truck needs to know, or at least it wants to know, for the active dampening suspension, where the truck is supposed to be sitting perfectly level or at normal ride height. And again, guys, I don't know of any other way to do this other than at the dealership. Luckily, I guess I kind of am the dealership, but let me spin you around. I'll kind of show you what that routine looks like on the factory software. So guys, this is the factory YTech scan tool software that technicians like myself use every single day to diagnose, to do software updates, and this is how we are going to be programming that ride height. So I am going to jump over to the active dampening control module, go to miscellaneous functions, and I am going to do an active dampening height sensor calibration. Now, this tells me this is only to be done if sensors or dampeners have been replaced, the vehicle must be on level ground, all doors closed, yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to continue. It's checking for codes, and it has successfully calibrated at our new ride height. So again, guys, I don't know of any other way you're going to be doing that unless you are going into the dealer. Hopefully you've got a cool dealer. Maybe they'll just do it really quick for you. At the most, I would think they would maybe charge an hour for that technician's time, but it unfortunately is pretty important for the active dampening suspension, for the shocks, for all the terrain management that we've got on these TRXs. that it knows where normal ride height sitting still is, so it can calculate where the truck is in suspension travel, dropout, compression, whatever. So unfortunately, it's going to be something you probably want to have done if you want the system working as good as it can be. Well guys, as you saw, it's really not too bad tearing the front of these things apart. It's some big massive hardware and then it just kind of falls apart for you. It's honestly not too bad. Even if you were down on the ground on a floor jack with jack stands, it wouldn't be that bad of a teardown. So hopefully you guys picked up a few kind of tips or tricks, I guess. That front shock sleeve that you got to slide out. And like I said, make sure you get in alignment. Anytime you change the ride height of the truck, you're going to want to make sure camber caster toe is in spec so you're not chewing up your expensive tires. And again, TRX at least specific, you're going to want to, unfortunately, take it into the dealership and have those ride height sensors calibrated so all of the terrain management and active valve and all of those suspension systems are happy and calibrated and working as they're supposed to. Now guys, I did just do the fronts today. I do have some rear springs to throw on this thing, so maybe I will make another video showing the rear process. It's a little bit less time consuming since you've just got a big solid axle, a couple of shock bolts, but I'll probably make a video later on, but that at least takes care of the front. That's going to be where most people are doing preload spacers and new springs once the aftermarket gets there. So guys, thanks for coming along with a long overdue TRX video. And guys, as always, thanks for watching and we'll catch you guys next time.